Hello, stellar people. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Trey, and today is the second part of a three-part watercolor tutorial. And today we're going to go over the basics, like the basics of watercolor, which is wet into wet, a little bit of dry brush, and then we're going to do this lovely illustration of Beautiful Bee's Kiss, just one layer. But first, let's start with my tool set. First, I have all my paints here. This is a set I have collected over many years. My little dish to hold the watercolors. My basic colors are yellow, blues, purples, greens, browns, and red. I have my little water dish on the side, but here I'm just doing a color test, right? To see what the color looks like when you put it down on paper. And of course, the thing that you have to remember is that watercolor dries lighter than it shows when it's wet. When it's wet, it's a darker color, and it'll dry and then fade a little bit. So you always have to remember that. So we have our mix, a little guide. Wet into wet is where you wet the paper beforehand and then introduce the colors after that. But there are some caveats in that it's hard to control. My table is slanted, so the colors will mostly pull down and then fade up. If you have an area that's not quite dry, you can get some color variances that you might not be happy with, but it is what makes watercolor unique. And so you kind of have to embrace it. I embrace it. The bottom is the dry brush. It's where you just apply watercolor from a dish and apply it directly to paper. And it's easier to control, and so you kind of play with both of these things, the wet into wet and the dry brush. And here is the image of Beautiful Bee's Kiss, all ready to go. And now what I first start with, I usually start with the character, because the character is usually the most important part of the piece. So I have usually a pink or a flesh tone. And the goal is to select everything that is going to be the flesh color except for white. You exclude white. And you go in and you paint the figure, or you paint the clothing, or whatever assortment of bits and bobs that there's in the painting. But you have to preserve the white, because the white will give you the contrast, right? You want contrast. Where are your lights? Where are your darks? Where are your lights? Where are your darks? And that's all that painting is. It's a play between light and dark. So in this, I am going for the base coat of the flesh tone. I always go for the character first, usually because they're usually the most important figure in an illustration. So I tested out a little bit of this new color, this orangey, with some reds and some flesh tones in it. And now I'm applying this fleshy orange color for her skin tone. And it's always nice to have, a bit of scrap watercolor on the side so you can test out colors. Just to make sure, if you're at all hesitant, give it a shot on a test piece before you apply it directly to your paper. But I've been doing this for a while, so I kind of know, but it's always good to, just in case. So now I do everything that is her flesh tone in this same orangey flesh color, while excluding the things that, I will paint later in different colors and whatnot. And once that's done, now I go for the green of her eyes because I think that makes her eyes pop. You know, having that little bit of, you know, the orange color of the skin, reddish orange hair, and green eyes and green clothing, with some, you know, some darker parts of it. You know, I've come up with that color scheme that I kind of liked, and so that's me applying that right now. I like this nice, it's my most basic of the greens. It's a bit of olive green, a bit of sap green, and a bit of green gold, which is a beautiful golden green color, all mixed. And so we now have her green part, her green clothing. And now I'm starting to apply my darks. Now for darks, I usually go for this magenta color. It's not too heavy, but it's just how I plan where my darks are gonna go. And the magenta is great because it fades lighter, and it's fairly easier to cover up with a dark, like a blue or a dark purple. So this is how I always start with my darks. This is my blocking in phase. I'm just trying to get coverage, and I'm just trying to, you know, it's my plan on the page, right? I'm planning on the page. And what I did, if you saw her arm bracelet on her right arm, I did that wet magenta, and then I pulled it up with a napkin just to fade that back. And you'll see me do that more often later on in painting. Yes, in the beginning, you're just trying to get your plan executed before you go heavier with more emphasis and stronger, more vibrant colors. In the beginning, you just want to go light. And right now, we're going to start with the background, which is going to be Beautiful Bee's Kiss Among the Clouds. So I'm going to do a very broad wet into wet, right, of all the background in a beautiful blue, sky blue shade. So I'm wetting the paper here. You gotta get it nice and wet for the wet into wet. Here's my blues. And now what wet into wet does, at its most basic level, it will diffuse colors, right? If it's a pale color or a very unsaturated watercolor, it'll diffuse that. If it's stronger color, it will diffuse that as well. But you have to control, you know, you don't want to go too dark, you want to go too light. You're trying to find that, you know, what makes your illustration work. And for the sky, I wanted a lot of clouds, or a fair amount of clouds. So that means using a very diffused blue color. So a lot of wet into wet with some already diffused blue. And that is our sky color. And it's going to be darker on the bottom for this one layer test, meaning it's lighter on top, dark on the bottom. And in part 3, we'll do the opposite of that. But that is the wet into wet in clouds. It's nice and soft. And now we're doing our darks. But I'm using wet into wet for the under her wings. So yes, I'm now going over the magenta, which, you know, as you can tell, is lighter than this dark blue I'm putting on. So it was a great test, a good test phase, right? And as you can see, I'm using this very small brush. This is also my detailing brush, but for my darks, I try to, you know, I try to be careful with it. All the little details that I want dark blue. But as you can see, it's starting to come together, right? We have our background, which is a diffused blue sky. Our character is the main focus. And now this is going to be her hair color. A nice reddish orange. But this is the basics of my painting process. I usually do this process most of the time with very little deviation. I kind of have it how I, like a process. Some more of that reddish orange for some shadows, just to give her a little bit more definition. I just lifted it up because I thought I applied too much, and I want that bottom lip to soften. This is the start of the detailing phase. The detailing phase can be a long phase because it's kind of what makes an image pop, right? And what I mean by pop is that the contrast between lights and darks, right? If you have a dark figure, light around it will make it pop, right? And then the opposite is also true. If you have a light figure, a dark background will make it pop. So for me, pop is higher contrast between lights and darks. So the character has to pop from the background, so you give her the most detail. And the detailing process is usually the longest and slowest, because you're now going in for these little tiny areas. And the eyes are one of the most important aspects of a character. The viewer will usually look at the eyes first before going on to the rest of the painting. So the face and eyes are usually the focus. And so I try to put the most detail work into those areas. And in watercolor, I usually make a batch of color, right? But as it dries, it'll get more and more concentrated. So usually during the week, I start off with a greater amount. I start off with a greater amount of watercolor in a dish, and as it dries over the week, it gets more and more concentrated. And so then I use that more concentrated form to do my detailing work. With a very tiny brush, a little bit of water. I think we almost have it. Yeah, and there we have Beautiful Bee's Kiss. All one layer without washing. I'll tell you about washing in the next episode. But she's all there. Details in the eyes, under the nose, her stripes, the green, and her dark underneath, her dark clothing underneath green. Yeah, she looks good. I approve this piece, but then I also did this piece, so don't mind that. So that was Beautiful Bee's Kiss. One layer, the basics of my painting process. And in episode 3, we will do a 3-layer watercolor of Beautiful Bee's Kiss, and I'll show you the contrast between this one and that one. But until then, I will see you in the next episode. Take care and keep shining. Bye-bye.